The story of women changing America is not a straight line of progress, nor a simple tale of rights granted and barriers removed. It is a long, tense, and often uneasy struggle over who counts as a full citizen, who gets to shape the nation's laws, and whose voices are heard when power is on the table. It begins in a country that spoke boldly about liberty while quietly assuming that political life belonged to men, and it unfolds across generations of women who refused to accept that contradiction as permanent. In the early United States, women's lives were legally and socially confined in ways that shaped everything that followed. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into that of her husband. She could not independently own most property, sign contracts, or control her wages. Education for girls was improving by the early 19th century, but it was still framed around making them better wives and mothers, not public actors. Politics, voting, office holding, lawmaking, all of it was considered a male sphere. Even the language of democracy was gendered. When the Declaration of Independence spoke of all men, most Americans heard exactly that. Yet from the beginning, women were part of the nation's moral and reform movements. Churches, temperance societies, and charitable organizations offered one of the few acceptable public outlets for female activism. It was in these spaces that women gained organizational skills, learned to speak in public, managed funds, wrote petitions, and built networks across towns and states. Those experiences became a training ground for something more radical. If women could organize to reform society, many began to ask, why were they excluded from shaping the laws that governed it? A key turning point came through the abolitionist movement, the fight to end slavery. Women who joined anti-slavery societies discovered both the power of collective action and the limits placed on their own authority. When female delegates were denied full participation at international anti-slavery meetings, the insult was sharp and personal. Among those who felt it deeply were women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who began to connect the struggle against slavery with the struggle against women's subordination. The logic of human equality, once taken seriously, did not stop at race or sex. In 1848, that growing frustration crystallized in a small town in upstate New York, Seneca Falls. There, a convention was called to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition of women. The gathering itself was modest, but its ideas were explosive. The Declaration of Sentiments, modeled deliberately on the Declaration of Independence, listed grievances against men as the ruling class and demanded a range of reforms. Among them was a demand many considered shocking, the right to vote. Even some supporters thought that step too bold, fearing it would discredit the movement. But the resolution passed, and with it the idea that political equality, not just moral influence, was the goal. From that moment, a women's rights movement existed in the United States, though it would fracture, regroup, and redefine itself many times. Figures like Susan B. Anthony devoted their lives to the cause, traveling constantly, giving speeches, organizing conventions, and pressing legislators. They faced ridicule, hostility, and sometimes outright violence. Newspapers mocked them as unnatural or unfeminine. Ministers denounced them from pulpits. Politicians dismissed them as a tiny minority out of step with respectable womanhood. But the movement endured because it was rooted in lived experience. Women who worked in factories, farms, and homes understood that laws about property, wages, divorce, and child custody shaped their daily survival. The Civil War and its aftermath reshaped the landscape in complicated ways. The abolition of slavery and the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments expanded citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved men, but not for women. The word male entered the Constitution for the first time in the 14th Amendment, a painful reminder that women's claims were being sidelined in a moment of sweeping change. The women's movement split over how to respond. Some activists believed that black men's suffrage should be supported as a matter of justice and strategy, while others argued that educated white women were more deserving voters than uneducated men of any race. These debates exposed racial and class tensions that would haunt the movement for decades. At the same time, black women activists insisted that their freedom could not be separated into neat categories of race or gender. Leaders like Sojourner Truth spoke powerfully about the double burden of racism and sexism. In her famous "Ain't I a Woman" speech, she challenged the idea that womanhood meant fragility and dependence, pointing to her own life of labor and survival. Her message foreshadowed a truth that would only later be widely acknowledged. The struggle for women's rights was never just one struggle, but many overlapping ones shaped by race, class, and region. By the late 19th century, suffrage organizations had become more structured and strategic. Groups like the National American Woman Suffrage Association worked state by state to win voting rights through referenda and legislative campaigns. The strategy was slow and often frustrating. Some Western territories and states, seeking to attract settlers or to present themselves as progressive, granted women the vote earlier than the East. Each victory was celebrated as proof that society did not collapse when women entered politics. Still, national change remained elusive. Opposition to women's suffrage was deeply rooted in ideas about gender roles. Many Americans believed that women's moral authority depended on staying outside the dirty world of politics. If women voted, critics warned, they would neglect their homes, undermine male authority, and destroy the family. Ironically, suffragists often responded by arguing that women's participation would purify politics, bringing maternal values of care and morality into public life. This argument both challenged and reinforced traditional gender expectations, showing how reformers sometimes worked within the very ideas they hoped to transform. The early 20th century brought new energy and new tactics. Younger activists, including figures like Alice Paul, looked to more confrontational strategies. Inspired by British suffragettes, they organized parades, pickets, and acts of civil disobedience. In 1913, a massive suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., the day before a presidential inauguration, put the issue dramatically in the public eye. When peaceful protesters were arrested and mistreated, public sympathy grew. The spectacle of respectable women being jailed for demanding the vote forced many Americans to reconsider their assumptions. World War I added another layer of complexity. As men went to war, women filled jobs in factories, offices, and farms. Their visible contribution to the national effort strengthened the argument that they deserved full citizenship. Suffrage leaders also appealed directly to President Woodrow Wilson, framing the vote as consistent with the democratic principles the United States claimed to defend abroad. The combination of long-term organizing, shifting public opinion, and political pressure finally produced a breakthrough. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, prohibiting the denial of the vote on the basis of sex. It was a landmark achievement, the result of more than 70 years of activism. Yet even this victory was incomplete. Many women of color, particularly in the South, still faced barriers like poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation that effectively blocked them from voting. Native American women's citizenship status was also restricted until later legislation. The amendment changed the legal framework, but not the entire reality of political exclusion. Even so, the entrance of millions of women into the electorate altered American politics in lasting ways. Politicians could no longer ignore issues framed as women's concerns, from public health to education and labor conditions. Women's organizations turned their attention to voter education and policy reform, proving that the vote was not an endpoint, but a tool. The struggle that had begun in small meeting halls and reform societies had forced the nation to redefine who belonged in its democracy, and it set the stage for the next chapters, where women would move not only into the voting booth, but into the corridors of power themselves. The decades after women secured the constitutional right to vote were not a quiet settling into equality, but a period of testing what political citizenship actually meant in practice. Casting a ballot was one form of power, but shaping laws, holding office, and influencing national priorities required access to institutions that had long been closed to women. The question shifted from whether women could participate at all to how their participation would transform the country and how the country would resist that transformation. In the 1920s and 1930s, women reformers turned their attention to a wide range of social and economic issues, many of them rooted in the rapid industrialization and urbanization that had reshaped American life. Settlement house leaders like Jane Addams had already demonstrated that women could be influential public intellectuals and policy advocates. Through institutions such as Hull House in Chicago, Addams and her colleagues studied poverty, labor conditions, sanitation, and education, gathering data and proposing concrete reforms. Their work helped legitimize the idea that social welfare and public health were proper subjects of government action, and that women had expertise to offer beyond the home. The Great Depression intensified these concerns. As unemployment soared and families struggled to survive, the federal government expanded its role in unprecedented ways under President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Women were deeply involved in shaping and implementing New Deal programs, even if their contributions were often overshadowed in popular memory. One of the most visible figures of the era was Frances Perkins, the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. As Secretary of Labor, she played a central role in designing Social Security, unemployment insurance, and labor standards that limited working hours and addressed child labor. Perkins's career illustrated a crucial shift. Women were no longer only lobbying from outside government, but directing policy from within. At the same time, the era's politics revealed persistent limits. Many New Deal programs were structured in ways that reflected and reinforced existing inequalities. Domestic and agricultural workers, jobs heavily held by women and people of color, were often excluded from early labor protections. The idea of a male breadwinner supporting a dependent wife shaped social policy, sidelining the economic realities of single women, widows, and married women who worked out of necessity. Political gains were real, but they unfolded within a framework that still treated women's full independence as secondary. World War II once again disrupted established gender roles. With millions of men in uniform, women entered industrial jobs on a massive scale, symbolized by the cultural icon of Rosie the Riveter. They worked in shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants, proving their capability in occupations previously defined as male. The federal government supported this shift through propaganda and, in some cases, child care programs tied to war production. Yet the wartime message was temporary by design. Women were encouraged to see their industrial work as patriotic service, not a permanent claim to economic equality. When the war ended, many women were pushed out of these jobs to make room for returning veterans. The late 1940s and 1950s are often remembered for a renewed emphasis on domesticity, suburban growth, and the ideal of the nuclear family. Popular culture celebrated the full-time housewife, and many women did embrace marriage and motherhood as central identities, but this image masked a more complex reality. Large numbers of women, especially working-class women and women of color, continued to work for wages. Their labor in offices, factories, hospitals, and homes as domestic workers remained essential to the economy, even if it was undervalued and poorly paid. This tension between cultural expectations and lived experience helped set the stage for a new wave of activism in the 1960s. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, and student activism created an atmosphere in which authority and tradition were being questioned across society. Women who participated in these movements often found themselves relegated to support roles, handling logistics, while men dominated leadership and public recognition. That experience sparked frustration and self-reflection. If movements for justice reproduced gender hierarchies internally, many women asked, how deep did the problem go? In 1963, the publication of The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan gave voice to a sense of dissatisfaction among many middle-class women. Friedan described the problem that has no name, a feeling of emptiness and confinement among women who had been told that marriage, children, and consumer comfort would be enough. While her analysis centered largely on white, suburban women, the book resonated widely and helped ignite what became known as the second wave of feminism. This movement expanded the agenda beyond voting rights to issues of employment discrimination, education, reproductive freedom, and legal equality. One of the key legislative milestones of this era was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which included a provision banning employment discrimination on the basis of sex. The inclusion of sex discrimination was controversial and, according to some accounts, initially added by opponents who hoped it would weaken the bill. Instead, it provided a powerful legal tool. Women filed complaints, challenged hiring and pay practices, and pressed the government to enforce the law. Organizations such as the National Organization for Women, co-founded by Friedan, worked to ensure that legal promises translated into real opportunities. Reproductive rights became another central battleground. Access to reliable contraception and safe abortion was linked to women's ability to control their education, careers, and family lives. Court decisions in the 1960s and early 1970s expanded privacy rights and limited state restrictions, culminating in a landmark Supreme Court ruling in 1973 that recognized a constitutional right to abortion, though that right would remain contested for decades. The debate over reproductive freedom revealed deep divisions over morality, religion, and the meaning of women's equality, and it mobilized both feminist and conservative movements on a national scale. Education was also transformed. Title Roman IX, a federal law passed in 1972, prohibited sex discrimination in educational programs receiving federal funds. Though often associated with athletics, its impact was much broader. It opened doors in professional schools, science and engineering programs, and academic careers where women had long been underrepresented. Over time, the presence of women in law schools, medical schools, and graduate programs grew dramatically, reshaping the professional class and the pipeline into leadership roles. The push for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing equal rights regardless of sex, known as the Equal Rights Amendment, represented both the ambition and the limits of the second wave. Passed by Congress in 1972, it required ratification by the states. Supporters argued that it would provide a clear legal standard against sex discrimination. Opponents, led by conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly, warned that it would undermine traditional family structures, expose women to military drafts, and erase legal distinctions they saw as protective. The intense campaign on both sides mobilized millions of women, showing that women were not a single political bloc, but participants in a wide ideological spectrum. Ultimately, the amendment fell short of ratification, a reminder that progress was neither inevitable nor universally defined. As these national debates unfolded, women were steadily increasing their presence in elected office. The numbers were still small, but each breakthrough mattered symbolically and practically. Women in Congress, state legislatures, and city governments often prioritized issues like education, healthcare, and family leave, though they also worked across the full range of policy. Their presence challenged assumptions about who looked like a leader and provided role models for younger generations. Over time, voters became more accustomed to seeing women on ballots not as novelties, but as serious contenders. The late 20th century also saw growing attention to the diversity of women's experiences. Black feminists, Latina activists, Asian American women, Native American leaders, and others insisted that gender could not be separated from race, class, immigration status, and sexuality. They highlighted issues such as sterilization abuse, welfare rights, workplace exploitation, and violence against women, broadening the movement's agenda. This more inclusive approach did not erase tensions, but it deepened the understanding that women's political progress was tied to broader struggles for social justice. By the end of the century, women had moved from the margins of political life into positions of visible authority. They served as mayors, governors, judges, cabinet officials, and party leaders. Each milestone built on the earlier battles for suffrage and legal equality, showing how formal rights, social movements, and individual careers intertwined. The transformation was uneven and incomplete, but the trajectory was clear. Women were not simply influencing politics from the outside, they were becoming the political establishment itself, reshaping institutions that had once excluded them and redefining power in the process. As women moved more visibly into positions of authority, the meaning of leadership itself began to shift, shaped by the paths they had to carve and the barriers they continued to face. The late 20th and early 21st centuries did not represent a simple victory lap after earlier struggles. Instead, they revealed how deeply embedded assumptions about gender, power, and legitimacy remained, even as legal doors had opened. In Congress, the presence of women steadily increased, though often in response to moments of public reckoning. The early 1990s were widely described as a turning point, sometimes called the Year of the Woman, after a wave of female candidates won seats in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Their campaigns were influenced in part by national conversations about sexual harassment and workplace discrimination, issues that had long been minimized. Women legislators pushed for stronger protections, family leave policies, and attention to health issues that had historically received less funding and research. Their work demonstrated how representation could shape the policy agenda, not because women thought identically, but because lived experience influenced what seemed urgent or neglected. At the same time, women were rising in the executive branch and the judiciary. Appointments to federal courts and cabinet positions placed women in roles where they could interpret laws and direct vast bureaucracies. These appointments mattered symbolically, signaling that authority was no longer automatically coded as male, but they also had concrete consequences. Decisions about civil rights enforcement, workplace regulation, education policy, and health programs were shaped by leaders whose perspectives had been shaped by decades of gender-based expectations and obstacles. One of the most visible breakthroughs came with the career of Sandra Day O'Connor, appointed as the first woman to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1981. Her presence on the court did not mean automatic agreement with feminist positions, but it altered the institution's image and internal dynamics. Over time, additional women joined the court, contributing to decisions on issues ranging from reproductive rights to employment discrimination. The idea that the highest legal authority in the country could include women as equal participants gradually became normalized, though each nomination was still scrutinized through the lens of gender. At the state level, women governors and legislators confronted practical governance challenges that went far beyond so-called women's issues. They managed budgets, responded to natural disasters, negotiated with business leaders, and dealt with partisan conflict. Their successes and failures were often interpreted in gendered ways, with media coverage scrutinizing their appearance, tone, and family roles alongside their policies. This scrutiny revealed a double standard. Women leaders were expected to be strong but not too assertive, compassionate but not soft, decisive but not abrasive. Navigating these expectations required political skill layered on top of policy expertise. The intersection of gender with race became even more visible as women of color broke additional barriers. Leaders such as Shirley Chisholm, who had earlier become the first black woman elected to Congress and later ran for a major party's presidential nomination, demonstrated that political ambition itself could be an act of defiance. Chisholm described herself as unbought and unbossed, emphasizing independence from party machines and special interests. Her campaigns highlighted how both racism and sexism shaped access to funding, media coverage, and party support, issues that would continue to confront candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. Grassroots activism remained a crucial force alongside formal political careers. The women's liberation movement of the 1970s had already emphasized consciousness-raising and local organizing, and these traditions continued in campaigns against domestic violence, sexual assault, and workplace harassment. Shelters, hotlines, and advocacy organizations emerged across the country, often started by volunteers who transformed personal pain into public action. Over time, their efforts led to legal reforms, funding for victim services, and shifts in public awareness. What had once been dismissed as private matters inside the home were reframed as social problems requiring state response. Economic change also shaped women's political influence. As more women entered the workforce and became primary or co-breadwinners, policies related to child care, pay equity, health insurance, and retirement security took on new urgency. Debates over parental leave and flexible work arrangements reflected broader questions about how a society organized around paid labor could accommodate caregiving, a responsibility still disproportionately carried by women. These were not only social issues, but economic ones, affecting productivity, poverty rates, and long-term growth. The media environment evolved in ways that both amplified and distorted women's political presence. Television and later digital platforms gave women leaders direct channels to the public, but they also intensified scrutiny and harassment. Female candidates and officials often faced online abuse that targeted their gender and appearance, adding a new layer to the old patterns of hostility. At the same time, social media allowed activists to organize rapidly, share stories, and challenge powerful figures. Viral campaigns around sexual harassment and assault revealed the scale of experiences that had long been hidden, forcing institutions from corporations to government agencies to confront misconduct. The question of the presidency remained a powerful symbol. For much of American history, the idea of a woman as commander-in-chief had seemed almost unimaginable. As more women gained high-level experience in law, business, and government, that perception began to shift. Major party nominations and competitive campaigns by women candidates demonstrated that large segments of the electorate were willing to envision female leadership at the highest level. Even when such campaigns fell short of victory, they altered the political imagination of the country, especially for younger generations who grew up seeing women debate foreign policy and national security on equal footing with men. Throughout these decades, legal battles continued to define the boundaries of equality. Court cases addressed issues such as pregnancy discrimination, sexual harassment, and gender-based violence, clarifying how constitutional principles and civil rights laws applied in practice. Each decision was shaped by earlier activism and, in turn, influenced future strategies. The law was not a neutral backdrop, but an arena where social norms were contested and redefined. International developments also fed back into American debates. Global conferences on women's rights, transnational advocacy networks, and comparisons with policies in other countries provided new arguments and benchmarks. Discussions about paid family leave, child care systems, and political representation were informed by examples from Europe, Latin America, and beyond. American women activists and policymakers operated in a world where ideas about gender equality circulated across borders, adding pressure for reform and alternative models to consider. By the early 21st century, the presence of women in American political life was undeniable, yet the distribution of power remained uneven. Women were still underrepresented in many top positions, and disparities in pay, wealth, and caregiving responsibilities persisted. The progress achieved over more than a century had expanded possibilities dramatically, but it had not erased structural inequalities or cultural assumptions overnight. The story was one of cumulative change, where each generation built on earlier gains while confronting new forms of resistance, proving again and again that political rights are not static possessions, but living practices shaped by constant struggle. The early 21st century brought a sense that the long arc of women's political struggle was entering a new phase, one in which earlier victories formed the foundation for more complex questions about power, identity, and representation. Women were no longer outsiders asking to be admitted into the system. They were inside, shaping laws, leading institutions, and influencing national conversations. Yet their presence did not dissolve conflict. Instead, it revealed how deeply gender expectations were woven into political culture. One of the most consequential developments was the increasing visibility of women in national executive leadership. When women served as secretaries of state, national security advisors, and other top officials, they engaged directly in diplomacy, military strategy, and international negotiations, areas long coded as masculine. Their roles challenged assumptions about who could speak with authority on war and peace. They navigated delicate geopolitical crises, met with foreign leaders, and represented the United States on the world stage, making clear that competence in global affairs was not tied to gender. The symbolism of a woman at the center of foreign policy had ripple effects at home. It influenced how young women imagined their own futures and how the public discussed leadership qualities. At the same time, it exposed how gendered narratives persisted. Media coverage often commented on clothing, voice, or demeanor in ways rarely applied to male counterparts. Strong positions could be labeled shrill, caution could be called weak, and ambition could be framed as unseemly. Women in high office had to perform a careful balancing act, projecting authority without triggering backlash rooted in long-standing stereotypes. The rise of women to leadership in the legislative branch also reshaped political priorities. As committee chairs, party leaders, and senior members, they influenced what bills reached the floor and how debates were framed. Issues like healthcare access, child nutrition, veterans' family support, and protections against gender-based violence gained sustained attention. These were not exclusively women's concerns, but women legislators often had personal or community experiences that made these topics impossible to ignore. Over time, the notion that such issues were peripheral gave way to recognition that they were central to economic stability and national well-being. Grassroots energy surged again in response to social and political shocks. Large-scale marches, local organizing, and voter mobilization drives brought millions of women into public action, some for the first time. They ran for school boards, city councils, and state legislatures, often motivated by specific policies affecting education, healthcare, immigration, or civil rights. This wave of local engagement echoed earlier eras, when women had built power through community networks before moving into higher office. It showed that political change was not only driven from the top, but seeded in neighborhoods and towns. Conversations about sexual harassment and assault entered mainstream political discourse with unprecedented force. Survivors shared their experiences across industries, including government, exposing patterns of abuse that had been tolerated or hidden. Investigations, resignations, and policy reforms followed. Workplaces revised reporting procedures, legislatures debated new protections, and voters re-evaluated candidates' records and behavior. The personal became undeniably political, in the sense that individual experiences of violation were linked to institutional cultures and power imbalances. The judiciary remained a crucial arena. Court rulings on employment discrimination, reproductive rights, and health care access had immediate consequences for millions of women. Changes in the composition of the courts could shift legal interpretations, making each nomination and confirmation battle intensely political. Advocacy groups on all sides invested heavily in these fights, recognizing that judicial decisions could either expand or restrict the scope of earlier gains. Women of diverse backgrounds continued to push the boundaries of representation. Candidates who were immigrants, members of religious minorities, openly LGBTQ, or from working-class backgrounds brought new perspectives into legislative debates. Their elections signaled to constituents who had long felt invisible that their experiences mattered in shaping national policy. At the same time, these leaders often faced overlapping forms of discrimination, including racist and xenophobic attacks layered onto sexism. Their careers illustrated both the progress made since the days when most women could not vote and the enduring challenges of an unequal society. Economic inequality remained a persistent thread. Even as women achieved high-profile successes, many struggled with low wages, unstable jobs, and inadequate access to child care and health services. Policy debates over minimum wage, tax credits, and social safety nets were deeply gendered in their effects. Single mothers, caregivers, and women in service sector jobs were especially vulnerable to economic downturns. Political advocacy around these issues drew connections between gender equality and broader economic justice, arguing that empowering women economically was not only fair but beneficial for the whole society. Education, once a battleground for access, became a story of both achievement and new tensions. Women's enrollment in higher education grew, and in many fields they became the majority of graduates. Yet disparities persisted in certain disciplines, leadership positions in academia, and student debt burdens. Policies about campus safety, harassment, and equity in sports and research funding remained contested. The promise of equal educational opportunity continued to require vigilance and enforcement. Throughout these developments, generational differences shaped feminist politics. Younger activists often emphasized intersectionality, climate justice, and digital organizing, while older generations brought institutional knowledge and long-term perspective. Sometimes their priorities aligned easily, other times they clashed over strategy and language. This dynamic was a sign of a living movement rather than a static ideology, constantly renegotiating its goals in response to new realities. The global dimension of women's political leadership also became more prominent. American women in government and civil society engaged with international efforts to address human trafficking, maternal health, girls' education, and gender-based violence worldwide. These issues were framed as matters of human rights and global stability, linking domestic policy to international commitments. The exchange of ideas and strategies across borders reinforced the sense that the struggle for women's political power was part of a broader human story. By this point, it was clear that the transformation begun in places like Seneca Falls had fundamentally altered American democracy. The electorate, the pool of candidates, and the policy agenda all bore the imprint of generations of women who had insisted on full citizenship. Yet the story was not one of arrival at a final destination. Each advance opened new questions about how to balance work and family, how to address persistent violence and discrimination, and how to ensure that leadership reflected the nation's diversity. The evolution of women's power in America remained an ongoing process, shaped by the same forces that had driven it from the start: collective action, legal change, cultural shifts, and the determination of individuals who refused to accept the limits placed on them. As the nation moved deeper into the 21st century, the presence of women in American political life began to feel less like an exception and more like a structural reality, yet that normalization did not make gender irrelevant. Instead, it changed the terrain. The question was no longer simply whether women could lead, but how leadership itself might be reimagined in a society still wrestling with inequality, polarization, and rapid change. One of the most striking developments was the visibility of women at the highest levels of the executive branch, including the election of a woman to the vice presidency of the United States for the first time in history with Kamala Harris. Her ascent reflected multiple strands of the long struggle: the fight for women's political inclusion, the civil rights movement's challenge to racial exclusion, and the growing recognition of the country's demographic diversity. For many Americans, seeing a woman, and a woman of Black and South Asian heritage, in such a role expanded the symbolic boundaries of who could embody national authority. For others, it intensified political and cultural anxieties, showing how representation could be both inspiring and polarizing. The executive branch more broadly saw women directing major departments, shaping economic recovery plans, public health responses, and foreign policy strategies. During times of crisis, including public health emergencies and economic disruptions, these leaders were responsible for decisions affecting millions of lives. Their visibility underscored a historical reversal. Where once women had been excluded on the grounds that they were too emotional or fragile for high-stakes decisions, they were now charged with managing complex national challenges under intense scrutiny. Political polarization added another layer to women's leadership. Women were prominent across the ideological spectrum, from progressive reformers to conservative advocates. This diversity made clear that women did not form a single voting bloc or policy position. Instead, they brought their perspectives into debates over taxation, immigration, gun policy, environmental regulation, and national security. The earlier assumption that women would naturally vote or govern in a more peaceful or socially oriented way proved overly simplistic. Gender shaped experience, but ideology, region, religion, and class were equally powerful influences. At the same time, certain issues continued to highlight gendered stakes. Debates over reproductive health, parental leave, and access to affordable child care remained central to electoral campaigns and legislative battles. Court decisions and state laws could dramatically alter the legal landscape, affecting women's bodily autonomy and economic security. These debates often drew on decades of legal precedent and activism, showing how the past was never truly past but lived on in contemporary struggles. The workplace remained a key arena of political and social change. As technology reshaped industries and remote work expanded, questions about flexibility, caregiving, and work-life balance took on new urgency. Women's disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work became especially visible during times when schools and care facilities closed, forcing families to improvise. Policymakers debated how to design social supports that acknowledged these realities, while businesses reconsidered long-standing assumptions about productivity and presence. The intersection of economic policy and gender roles was impossible to ignore. Violence against women, both domestic and public, continued to demand attention. Legislative efforts to strengthen protections fund prevention programs, and improve law enforcement responses built on earlier activism. High-profile cases and investigative reporting kept the issue in public view, challenging the tendency to treat such violence as isolated incidents rather than systemic problems. Women in office often used their platforms to push for reforms, drawing on advocacy networks that had been developed over decades. Another significant shift was the way young women entered politics with expectations shaped by a different world than their predecessors. They had grown up with women teachers, doctors, lawyers, and politicians as a normal part of life. Many had benefited from educational opportunities opened by earlier reforms. Their activism often linked gender equality to climate change, racial justice, and economic inequality, reflecting a holistic view of social problems. Digital tools allowed them to organize rapidly, fundraise from small donors, and bypass traditional gatekeepers. This changed who could realistically run for office and how campaigns were conducted. Yet progress did not eliminate backlash. Moments of rapid change often triggered movements that sought to reassert traditional gender roles and hierarchies. Political rhetoric sometimes framed feminism as a threat to family or national identity. Online spaces amplified hostility, with female public figures facing coordinated harassment. These reactions echoed earlier eras when gains for women had been met with warnings of social collapse. The persistence of such narratives underscored how deeply questions of gender were tied to broader anxieties about cultural change. The relationship between representation and policy outcomes remained complex. Having more women in office did not automatically produce specific laws, but it did broaden the range of experiences considered legitimate in decision-making. Stories about caregiving, reproductive health, workplace discrimination, and community safety entered legislative hearings and public debates with new authority when voiced by those who had lived them. This experiential knowledge complemented traditional forms of expertise, enriching democratic deliberation. Looking across more than a century and a half, from the early conventions demanding the vote to contemporary debates over leadership and rights, a pattern emerges. Each generation of women confronted a political system that had been built without them in mind and worked to reshape it from within and without. They used petitions, protests, court cases, elections, and cultural change to expand the boundaries of citizenship. They disagreed among themselves about strategy and priorities, reflecting the diversity of the nation itself. Their progress was uneven, marked by breakthroughs and setbacks, but cumulative. The transformation they drove did more than alter women's status. It changed the meaning of American democracy. Expanding who counts as a political actor inevitably reshapes the issues considered important, the solutions proposed, and the values emphasized. The presence of women in power challenged narrow definitions of strength, authority, and public service, opening space for a broader understanding of leadership. In that sense, the story of women who changed America is not a separate chapter from the nation's history. It is a central thread, woven through every major debate about rights, responsibility, and the unfinished promise of equality. The deeper this transformation went, the clearer it became that women's political power was not a single achievement, but a shifting relationship between citizens and the state, between private lives and public decisions. Earlier generations had fought to prove that women belonged in the political sphere at all. Now the struggle increasingly revolved around how the structures of politics could better reflect the realities of people's lives, especially the interconnected roles of worker, caregiver, community member, and individual with rights over one's own body. One of the enduring legacies of women's activism was the insistence that policies once dismissed as personal or domestic were in fact matters of public consequence. Health care, for example, had long been shaped by assumptions about women primarily as dependents rather than decision-makers. As more women entered medicine, public health, and policy leadership, attention expanded to maternal mortality, reproductive health, and gender bias in medical research. Data revealed disparities that had been obscured when male bodies were treated as the default in clinical studies. Addressing these gaps required political will, funding, and institutional reform, linking scientific practice directly to legislative priorities. Family policy followed a similar path. For much of American history, caregiving had been treated as a private responsibility, managed within families with little state support. But as women's paid labor became essential to household survival and national productivity, the mismatch between work structures and family needs became a political issue. Debates over paid family leave, child tax credits, and early childhood education were not only about compassion. They were about economic competitiveness, workforce participation, and long-term social stability. Women legislators and activists were often at the forefront of these arguments, though they worked alongside male allies and across party lines in complex coalitions. Immigration policy also intersected with women's experiences in specific ways. Women migrants worked in domestic labor, agriculture, healthcare, and service industries, often in precarious conditions. Policies affecting visa status, labor protections, and access to services had gendered consequences, influencing vulnerability to exploitation and family separation. Advocates highlighted the stories of women who crossed borders to support children or escape violence, challenging narratives that reduced immigration to numbers or security concerns alone. This perspective broadened public understanding of migration as a human and social issue as well as a legal one. In the realm of national security, women's roles continued to expand. They served in the armed forces, intelligence agencies, and diplomatic corps at higher levels than ever before. Their participation prompted changes in military policy, including the integration of women into combat roles and efforts to address sexual harassment within the ranks. These shifts were contentious and gradual, but they demonstrated how institutions historically defined by masculinity could evolve under pressure from social change and internal advocacy. The cultural dimension of political power remained significant. Film, television, literature, and digital media shaped how Americans imagined leaders. Portrayals of women as presidents, generals, and policymakers in fiction both reflected and influenced real-world expectations. Representation in media did not automatically produce equality, but it helped normalize images that would have seemed implausible a century earlier. At the same time, stereotypes persisted, and women in public life often had to contend with narratives that reduced them to archetypes rather than recognizing their complexity. Religion also played a role in shaping women's political engagement, sometimes in surprising ways. Faith communities were sites of both resistance to and support for gender equality. Women organized within religious traditions to advocate for social justice, humanitarian aid, and ethical governance, while others mobilized around issues like abortion, education, and family policy from more conservative perspectives. This diversity challenged the idea that religion and feminism were inherently opposed, showing instead that women interpreted faith through varied political lenses. Technology introduced new opportunities and risks. Online platforms allowed women candidates to reach voters directly, organize supporters, and raise funds without relying entirely on traditional party structures. Grassroots movements could gain national attention quickly. At the same time, digital spaces exposed women, especially those from marginalized groups, to harassment and disinformation campaigns. Protecting democratic participation increasingly required addressing these threats, linking gender equality to broader concerns about the health of the information ecosystem. Generational change continued to reshape the political landscape. Young women who entered politics in this era did so with a sense that leadership was an attainable path, not an extraordinary exception. Many cited earlier pioneers as inspiration, but they also sought to redefine success on their own terms, emphasizing collaboration, transparency, and community engagement. Their presence suggested that the long struggle for inclusion had altered not only who governed, but how governance might be practiced. Looking back across this history, certain patterns stand out. Gains often came through a combination of moral argument, practical demonstration, and institutional leverage. Women proved their capacity in reform movements, in workplaces, in wartime service, and in professional fields, undermining claims that they were unfit for political responsibility. Legal changes codified these shifts, but laws alone were never enough. Cultural attitudes, economic structures, and political incentives all had to move, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly. The resistance they faced was also patterned. Each expansion of women's power prompted fears about social disorder, family breakdown, or loss of tradition. Yet over time, what had once seemed radical became routine. Women voting, practicing law, serving in Congress, or commanding military units moved from controversy to normalcy. This normalization did not mean that equality had been fully achieved, but it showed how democratic societies evolve through contestation. Ultimately, the story of women who changed America is a story about the constant renegotiation of citizenship. It reveals that democracy is not a fixed inheritance, but a living system shaped by those who insist on being counted. Women entered that system in larger and larger numbers, brought their experiences and demands, and in doing so altered its priorities and possibilities. Their journey from exclusion to influence demonstrates how power can be expanded without being seized in a single moment, through persistence, coalition building, and the belief that the promise of equality, however imperfectly realized, is worth the struggle. What becomes most striking, when viewed across the sweep of this history, is how women's political transformation in the United States has been both institutional and deeply personal, altering not only laws and offices, but the texture of everyday expectations about authority, voice, and belonging. A girl growing up in the early 21st century inherits a political world fundamentally different from that of her great-great-grandmother, yet that world was built through countless acts of insistence by women who refused to remain on the margins. The expansion of women's leadership has changed how problems are defined at the national level. Consider how discussions of infrastructure, once focused almost entirely on roads and bridges, increasingly include child care systems, elder care, and health services. These are forms of social infrastructure, essential to economic life, yet historically invisible in policy debates dominated by male breadwinner models. Women policymakers, advocates, and researchers helped bring this language into the mainstream, reframing care work as a public good rather than a private burden. Environmental politics offers another example. Women have been prominent in local and national movements addressing pollution, clean water, and climate change, often connecting environmental harm to family health and community survival. Their activism draws on a long tradition in which women organized around food safety, sanitation, and neighborhood conditions, seeing the link between environmental quality and daily life. By translating scientific concerns into human terms, they have influenced legislation, regulatory policy, and public awareness. The corporate and non-profit sectors, though not governmental, are also part of the political ecosystem. Women who rose to leadership in these arenas have shaped labor practices, philanthropy, and public-private partnerships. Decisions made in boardrooms about wages, parental leave, diversity initiatives, and community investment have political implications, affecting millions of workers and families. The boundary between public policy and private power is porous, and women's entry into these spheres has broadened the range of voices in decisions that shape national life. At the same time, the persistence of gender-based violence and discrimination has been a stark reminder that formal equality does not automatically ensure safety or respect. Movements demanding accountability from powerful men in entertainment, business, academia, and politics exposed how authority could shield abuse. Legal reforms, workplace policies, and cultural conversations followed, but the process of change has been uneven. The willingness of survivors to speak publicly, often at personal cost, echoed earlier eras when women had to break silence to make hidden injustices visible. Political campaigns themselves have evolved as women have become more central participants. Strategies for outreach increasingly recognize the importance of issues such as school quality, healthcare access, and community safety, not as niche concerns, but as decisive electoral factors. Women as voters have never been monolithic, but their turnout and engagement have been critical in close elections. Campaigns invest heavily in understanding how policies affect women's lives at different income levels, family structures, and geographic regions. The legal profession has played a crucial role in translating activism into durable change. Women lawyers, judges, and scholars have developed arguments that reinterpret constitutional principles in light of gender equality, influencing case law and legislation. Concepts such as sexual harassment as a form of discrimination or pregnancy discrimination as a civil rights issue emerged from sustained legal advocacy. These ideas reshaped workplaces and public institutions, demonstrating how shifts in interpretation can have wide-ranging social effects. Education in civics and history has also been affected. Curricula that once focused almost exclusively on male political leaders now increasingly include women's contributions, altering how new generations understand the nation's past. Recognizing women as historical agents, not merely as supporters or symbols, reinforces the idea that political participation is open to all. This change in historical memory feeds back into contemporary ambition, as representation in the past legitimizes aspiration in the present. Despite these advances, disparities remain stark in certain areas. Women, particularly women of color, are still underrepresented in the highest corporate offices, in some areas of technology and finance, and in parts of the political system. Pay gaps and wealth gaps persist, shaped by occupational segregation, caregiving interruptions, and discrimination. These inequalities influence political power, since running for office or influencing policy often requires financial resources and networks. Addressing them involves not only individual advancement, but structural reform. Polarization and mistrust in political institutions pose additional challenges. Women leaders, like their male counterparts, must operate in an environment where compromise is often difficult and public discourse is fragmented. Yet some observers note that collaborative leadership styles often associated with women, though by no means exclusive to them, can offer alternative approaches to governance. Whether such styles can thrive in highly adversarial systems remains an open question, one that connects leadership culture to broader democratic health. Internationally, the United States is both a model and a subject of critique regarding women's political representation. American women engage with global movements advocating for quotas, legal reforms, and human rights, while also confronting domestic debates over similar issues. This exchange underscores that the story of women's political power is part of a worldwide conversation about democracy and equality. All of these threads point back to the original insight of early women's rights advocates, that excluding half the population from political life distorts democracy itself. When women demanded the vote, they were not only seeking a personal privilege, but challenging a system built on partial representation. Each subsequent wave of activism extended that challenge, asking whose voices are still missing and how institutions might change to include them. The cumulative effect has been to redefine citizenship as something more expansive and dynamic than earlier generations imagined. Women's political participation has reshaped agendas, altered institutions, and changed cultural expectations. It has shown that progress is rarely linear and never uncontested, but also that determined collective action can expand the boundaries of possibility. The nation that once treated women's political ambitions as unnatural now depends on women's leadership in nearly every sphere of public life, a transformation that continues to unfold with each election, each law, and each voice raised in the ongoing debate over what American democracy should be. And yet, for all the institutional milestones and headline-making breakthroughs, the deepest measure of change may lie in the quiet normalization of women's authority in the rhythms of daily civic life. School boards, zoning commissions, public health departments, teachers' unions, neighborhood associations, and local courts are filled with women making decisions that shape how communities function. These arenas rarely attract national attention, but they are where democracy is experienced most directly. Women's sustained presence in these roles has helped embed the idea that governance is not an abstract contest among distant elites, but an ongoing, practical responsibility shared by ordinary citizens. This normalization has altered family dynamics as well. When daughters grow up seeing mothers, aunts, or community members engaged in political discussion, attending meetings, or running for office, civic participation becomes part of the expected life course rather than an exceptional leap. Boys, too, grow up with a different sense of who can lead and whose voices matter. These shifts in socialization are difficult to measure, but they accumulate over time, shaping the culture in which formal politics unfolds. At the same time, the balancing act between public leadership and private responsibility remains a defining feature of many women's political careers. Although norms have evolved, women still tend to shoulder a larger share of caregiving work, and this reality influences decisions about when and whether to seek office. Campaign schedules, travel, and the demands of public scrutiny can strain family life. Some women delay political ambitions until children are older. Others bring family into the public eye, challenging the idea that leadership requires a separation from domestic roles. Their choices highlight the ongoing negotiation between structures built around traditional male life patterns and the diverse realities of modern families. The concept of role modeling has taken on new weight. When women occupy positions once considered unattainable, they do more than make policy, they expand the realm of the imaginable. This symbolic power is especially significant for those from historically marginalized communities. Seeing leaders who share aspects of one's identity can foster political engagement and ambition, reinforcing the link between representation and participation. At the same time, the pressure of symbolism can be heavy. Women leaders are often expected to represent not only their constituents, but their entire gender or community, a burden rarely placed on men. Political language itself has evolved under the influence of women's activism. Terms such as sexual harassment, glass ceiling, reproductive justice, and gender gap entered common usage through decades of organizing and scholarship. These phrases give shape to experiences that might otherwise remain diffuse or individualized, enabling collective understanding and policy response. The creation of language is a form of power, shaping what can be debated and what solutions seem plausible. Coalition building has been another hallmark of women's political influence. Because women's lives intersect with so many policy areas, health, education, labor, housing, immigration, they have often built alliances across movements. Labor organizers, civil rights activists, disability advocates, and environmental groups have found common cause with women's organizations on specific issues. These coalitions are not always stable, and priorities can conflict, but they illustrate a style of politics that emphasizes interconnection rather than isolation. The evolution of political fundraising has also affected women's pathways to power. Networks that support female candidates, including small donor platforms and mentorship organizations, have helped counter historical disadvantages in access to wealth and party backing. Training programs teach campaign skills, media strategy, and policy development, professionalizing women's political participation. These infrastructures did not exist for earlier generations and represent a significant institutional gain. Yet the story remains marked by uneven geography. Women's political representation and policy environments vary widely by state and region. Local cultures, party structures, and economic conditions shape opportunities and constraints. In some areas, women hold a substantial share of legislative seats and executive offices. In others, they remain a small minority. This variation reminds us that national narratives can obscure local realities, and that the struggle for inclusion continues on multiple fronts simultaneously. Another ongoing tension involves the relationship between individual success and collective advancement. Celebrating trailblazers is important, but it can create the impression that barriers have disappeared once a few high-profile women break through. Activists and scholars often caution against equating symbolic firsts with structural equality. The presence of women at the top does not automatically transform conditions for those at the bottom, particularly in low-wage work or marginalized communities. Bridging this gap requires sustained attention to economic and social policy, not only representation. The historical arc from disenfranchisement to leadership also invites reflection on the nature of progress itself. Many gains have come through legal reform, yet rights secured in law can be narrowed, reinterpreted, or unevenly enforced. Court decisions, legislative changes, and administrative rules can all shift the practical meaning of equality. This reality reinforces the lesson that political rights require ongoing defense and engagement, not passive reliance on past victories. Throughout this long journey, one constant has been the power of collective action. From 19th-century conventions to modern marches and digital campaigns, women have gathered to share stories, articulate demands, and pressure institutions. These gatherings create communities of purpose that sustain individuals through setbacks and disagreements. They also generate new leaders, as participants develop skills and confidence that translate into broader political roles. Ultimately, the story of women who changed America is not only about those whose names appear in history books, though their contributions are significant. It is also about the countless women who voted, volunteered, organized, testified, mentored, and persisted in the face of indifference or hostility. Their cumulative efforts reshaped a political system that once excluded them, expanding the meaning of citizenship for everyone. The process is unfinished, as all democratic projects are, but it stands as one of the most profound transformations in the nation's history. The gradual, determined inclusion of women as full and indispensable architects of American public life. If we step back far enough, the transformation appears almost revolutionary, though it unfolded without a single dramatic rupture. A political order that once defined women primarily through dependence, domesticity, and legal invisibility has been reworked, piece by piece, into one in which women are lawmakers, judges, diplomats, soldiers, scholars, organizers, and heads of complex institutions. This change did not erase conflict between visions of gender, family, and authority, but it ensured that those conflicts would be argued in a public sphere where women themselves hold power. One of the most profound shifts has been the redefinition of expertise. In earlier eras, knowledge drawn from women's lives about childbirth, caregiving, household management, or community networks was often dismissed as private or informal. As women entered universities, professions, and research institutions in larger numbers, these domains became subjects of systematic study and public policy. Fields such as public health, social work, education, and family law grew in status and influence, in part because women insisted that the well-being of families and communities was not secondary to economic or military concerns, but foundational to national strength. This redefinition of what counts as political knowledge has influenced budgeting and governance. Debates over public spending increasingly include the long-term costs of neglecting health care, early childhood development, and social services. Advocates argue that investments in these areas prevent deeper crises later, a perspective rooted in the preventive and relational approaches often associated with women's activism. While such arguments are not universally accepted, they have permanently expanded the range of considerations in policy making. The presence of women in journalism and media leadership has also shaped political culture. Women reporters, editors, and commentators have brought attention to issues that might otherwise be sidelined and have challenged narratives that treat politics as a game divorced from human consequences. Investigative work on workplace abuse, health disparities, and family policy has informed public debate and legislative agendas. Media, like government, is an arena where power is exercised, and women's entry into this sphere has had ripple effects. Another significant development has been the increasing visibility of care as a political value. For much of modern political theory, ideals such as autonomy, competition, and individual achievement dominated. Feminist thinkers and activists argued that interdependence, vulnerability, and mutual responsibility are equally fundamental features of human life. These ideas have influenced discussions about disability rights, elder care, public health, and social insurance. They challenge the notion that strength is defined solely by independence, suggesting instead that societies thrive when they acknowledge and support the web of relationships that sustain people across a lifetime. At the same time, women's political engagement has highlighted the limits of representation alone. Structural inequalities linked to race, class, and geography mean that not all women benefit equally from formal gains. Rural women, women in low-wage service work, undocumented migrants, and those in under-resourced communities face barriers that differ from those encountered by professionals in urban centers. Political movements that center these differences have pushed for more nuanced approaches, recognizing that gender justice is inseparable from broader struggles against poverty and discrimination. The global flow of ideas has continued to influence American debates. Concepts such as gender mainstreaming, which seeks to evaluate all policies through a gender lens, and international frameworks on violence against women have informed advocacy and legislation. American activists both contribute to and learn from these global conversations, reinforcing the idea that the pursuit of equality transcends national borders while taking distinct forms in different contexts. The story also includes moments of disappointment and retrenchment. Legal protections can be narrowed, funding for social programs can be cut, and political climates can shift toward exclusion. These setbacks do not erase earlier achievements, but they remind us that democratic gains are not self-sustaining. Women's organizations, legal advocates, and community groups often find themselves defending ground once thought secure, illustrating that progress requires vigilance as well as vision. Through all these changes, one theme remains constant. The expansion of women's political power has deepened democracy by bringing a wider range of experiences into the public sphere. Decisions about war and peace, taxation and spending, education, and health are made with input from people whose lives reflect the full diversity of the nation. This does not guarantee wise or just outcomes, but it makes exclusion harder to justify and broadens the conversation about what justice requires. The journey from disenfranchisement to leadership reveals how power can be transformed through persistence rather than sudden overthrow. Women use the tools available: speech, association, litigation, elections, scholarship, art to challenge their marginalization. They built institutions, mentored successors, and adapted strategies as circumstances changed. Their work shows that political systems are not fixed structures, but evolving arrangements shaped by those who participate in them. As new generations step into public life, they inherit both the rights won by earlier struggles and the unfinished tasks those struggles left behind. Questions about economic inequality, bodily autonomy, safety, representation, and the balance between work and care remain urgent. The history of women who changed America does not offer simple answers, but it provides a powerful example of how determined citizens can expand the meaning of equality over time. It is a testament to the idea that democracy grows stronger when those once kept at the edges move to the center, bringing with them new perspectives, new priorities, and an unshakable insistence on being heard. In the end, the transformation of women's place in American political life is inseparable from the transformation of the nation's understanding of itself. A republic that once limited political voice to a narrow slice of its population has been pushed, decade after decade, to confront the gap between its founding ideals and its lived reality. Women's demands for inclusion did not simply add new participants to an unchanged system. They altered the system's assumptions about authority, citizenship, and whose experiences matter in the making of law. This shift can be seen in how the very concept of rights has evolved. Early women's rights advocates focused on formal legal barriers: the vote, property ownership, access to education. Later generations confronted more subtle forms of exclusion embedded in workplace practices, cultural expectations, and institutional routines. The struggle moved from opening doors to questioning how the rooms themselves were arranged. Why were career paths structured around uninterrupted employment when many people's lives included periods of caregiving? Why were safety standards or medical research designed around male bodies? Why were leadership traits defined in ways that penalized collaboration or emotional intelligence? These questions reshaped policy discussions across fields. Women's political engagement also complicated the boundary between public and private life. Issues once dismissed as personal, domestic violence, sexual harassment, reproductive decision-making were reframed as matters of justice and public concern. This reframing did not mean that privacy lost value. Rather, it meant that privacy could no longer be used as a shield for inequality or abuse. The home, the workplace, and the body itself became recognized as sites where power operates and where rights must be protected. Another enduring impact has been the emphasis on process as well as outcome. Women activists often highlighted how decisions were made, not only what decisions were reached. They called attention to who was in the room, whose testimony was heard, and whose expertise was recognized. This focus on inclusion in deliberation helped broaden democratic practice, encouraging transparency, consultation, and community engagement. While such practices are not universally applied, they have become part of the vocabulary of good governance. The political realignment of women has also influenced party strategies and electoral coalitions. Parties analyze gender gaps in voting patterns, tailor messages to different groups of women, and recruit female candidates to reflect the electorate. This attention is sometimes instrumental, driven by electoral calculations, but it nonetheless acknowledges women as central political actors. Campaign issues such as healthcare, education, and economic security are framed with women's experiences in mind, reinforcing their role in shaping national priorities. At the cultural level, the narrative of who belongs in power has been irrevocably altered. Images of women debating policy, presiding over courtrooms, commanding military units, and negotiating international agreements circulate widely. These images coexist with ongoing stereotypes and resistance, but they cannot easily be erased. They form part of the collective memory and expectation of what leadership looks like. Still, the story resists a tidy conclusion. Gains in representation and rights exist alongside persistent disparities in pay, wealth, safety, and access to opportunity. Legal frameworks can change with shifting political winds. Social norms evolve unevenly, advancing in some communities while lagging in others. The progress achieved is real and substantial, yet it remains contingent, dependent on continued participation and vigilance. What this long history ultimately demonstrates is that democracy is not a static inheritance, but a practice shaped by those who insist on their place within it. Women's political journey in the United States shows how citizenship can expand through sustained effort, coalition building, and the courage to challenge entrenched assumptions. From the first demands for suffrage to contemporary debates over leadership and equality, women have acted not only on their own behalf, but on behalf of a more inclusive vision of the nation. Their impact is measured not only in laws passed or offices held, but in the altered expectations of generations who now take women's public authority as a given rather than an anomaly. The presence of women in every level of political life has changed conversations, priorities, and possibilities. It has demonstrated that the health of a democracy depends on the participation of all its members, and that progress, however uneven, is made by those willing to push the boundaries of what seems possible again and again, until the impossible becomes ordinary. And as the impossible became ordinary, another layer of change took hold, quieter but no less significant: the internalization of political identity among women as a normal dimension of selfhood. Where earlier generations often had to justify their presence in public debate, later generations grew up assuming that opinions about budgets, wars, schools, and courts were theirs to hold and express. This psychological shift, the sense of unquestioned belonging in the civic sphere, may be one of the most far-reaching outcomes of the long struggle. Civic participation is shaped not only by laws, but by confidence, by whether individuals believe their voices carry legitimacy. Women's history in America shows how that sense of legitimacy is constructed. It emerges from seeing others like oneself in positions of authority, from being taught a history that includes one's group as agents rather than bystanders, and from experiencing institutions that respond, however imperfectly, to one's concerns. As these conditions expanded, political engagement among women diversified. Some pursued office, others organized, others focused on policy research, law, journalism, or community leadership. Power became less a distant abstraction and more a field of possible action. This shift has influenced how crises are interpreted and addressed. During economic downturns, public health emergencies, or natural disasters, attention to caregiving burdens, food security, and community networks has become part of mainstream response planning. These concerns were always present in lived experience, but women's political influence helped translate them into formal priorities. Relief packages, school meal programs, health outreach, and domestic violence services entered emergency discussions as essential components rather than afterthoughts. Such integration reflects a broader understanding of resilience, one that values social infrastructure alongside physical reconstruction. The legal landscape continues to evolve in response to changing social norms and political pressures. Court battles over equality, bodily autonomy, and discrimination illustrate that rights are interpreted within historical contexts. Precedents can be affirmed, narrowed, or overturned, affecting millions of lives. Women lawyers, judges, activists, and scholars remain central to these debates, drawing on decades of legal theory and lived experience. Their arguments often connect individual dignity to constitutional principles, reinforcing the idea that equality is not a special interest, but a core democratic value. At the same time, the commercialization of politics poses challenges. Campaign costs, media markets, and lobbying structures can privilege those with wealth and connections. Women, particularly from marginalized communities, may face additional hurdles in fundraising and network access. Efforts to build alternative funding models and support systems represent another frontier of the struggle, aimed at ensuring that political opportunity is not limited to a narrow elite. These initiatives echo earlier organizing traditions, adapting them to contemporary realities. The language of leadership has broadened as well. Qualities such as empathy, collaboration, and attentiveness to lived experience, once dismissed as soft, are increasingly recognized as strengths in complex societies. While these traits are not exclusive to women, their elevation owes much to women's long effort to validate forms of knowledge and authority rooted in relationship and care. Leadership is still contested terrain, but the range of acceptable styles has widened. Education remains a central pathway. Programs that encourage girls and young women to engage in debate, science, technology, and civic service build on earlier fights for access. Mentorship networks connect experienced leaders with newcomers, creating lines of transmission across generations. These structures help sustain momentum, preventing each cohort from having to start from scratch. They embody a historical memory of struggle, turning it into practical guidance for the future. Cultural narratives continue to shape possibilities. Stories of past pioneers, of setbacks overcome and institutions changed, provide a repertoire of examples that inform present action. They remind audiences that today's normal was yesterday's radical demand. At the same time, new stories emerge, reflecting contemporary complexities around identity, family, work, and belonging. The narrative of women in American politics is not fixed. It is continually rewritten as new actors enter the stage. Yet the persistence of inequality underscores that representation alone cannot dissolve structural barriers. Economic precarity, racial discrimination, and geographic isolation shape political voice. Women's movements that address these intersections argue that democracy requires material conditions that allow participation: time, resources, safety, and education. Without these, formal rights may exist in theory, but remain difficult to exercise in practice. This insight links gender justice to broader questions about social policy and economic design. Across all these developments, the through line is agency. Women were not passively incorporated into politics. They organized, argued, litigated, voted, ran, governed, and imagined alternatives. Their strategies shifted with circumstances, from petitions to protests, from courtroom briefs to digital campaigns. Each tactic reflected an assessment of where leverage could be found. This adaptability has been key to the longevity and impact of their political engagement. The cumulative effect is a political culture that, while still marked by conflict and inequality, cannot plausibly revert to a model of governance that excludes women's authority. The institutions have been altered, the expectations reset, the precedents established. Future struggles will take new forms, addressing technologies, global interdependence, and evolving social norms. But they will unfold in a landscape already reshaped by generations of women who insisted that democracy live up to its promises. Their story is therefore not a closed chapter, but a continuing current within American history, a force that has redirected the flow of political life and continues to do so with each new voice that enters the conversation. Over time, this current has not only redirected political life, but reoriented the moral vocabulary of the nation. Ideas about fairness, responsibility, and freedom have been refracted through the experiences women brought into public debate. Freedom came to be understood not only as the absence of government interference, but as the presence of real options, the ability to leave a violent relationship, to decide whether and when to have children, to pursue education or work without facing automatic exclusion. Responsibility expanded beyond individual self-sufficiency to include collective obligations to care for the young, the sick, and the elderly. Fairness came to encompass not only equal treatment under the law, but attention to conditions that systematically disadvantage certain groups. These shifts did not occur because women spoke with one voice or held identical beliefs. On the contrary, women's political participation revealed sharp ideological differences. Some advocated expansive social programs, others championed limited government and traditional family structures. The significance lies in the fact that these debates unfolded with women as central actors, shaping the direction of policy regardless of which side prevailed in a given moment. The political spectrum itself adjusted to women's presence. The long struggle also changed the relationship between time and politics. Early suffragists knew they would not see the full fruits of their labor. They worked for future generations. That long view has remained a feature of many women's movements, emphasizing gradual, sustained change rather than instant victory. This perspective recognizes that cultural norms, institutional practices, and legal frameworks evolve at different speeds. It values incremental gains and the patient building of infrastructure, organizations, training programs, legal precedents that can endure beyond a single election cycle. Memory plays a powerful role here. Commemorations, museums, scholarship, and public holidays that recognize women's history help sustain a sense of continuity. They link present struggles to past ones, offering both inspiration and caution. The memory of earlier exclusions reminds citizens that rights once denied can be denied again, while the memory of hard-won victories shows that change is possible even against entrenched opposition. The transformation of women's political power has also influenced how other movements articulate their claims. Campaigns for disability rights, LGBTQ equality, and racial justice have drawn on strategies pioneered in women's activism, including consciousness raising, legal test cases, and the framing of personal experience as political evidence. Alliances have formed and reformed, reflecting both shared goals and tensions. The cross-pollination of ideas illustrates how expanding democracy in one area can open space for expansion in others. At the level of everyday interaction, the presence of women in authority has reshaped social expectations. Citizens are more accustomed to receiving instructions, rulings, and guidance from women in positions of power, whether as judges, police chiefs, professors, or legislators. This familiarity chips away at unconscious biases, even as new stereotypes may emerge. Cultural change is uneven and incomplete, but the baseline of what seems normal has shifted. Still, the future remains open. Technological change, economic restructuring, demographic shifts, and global challenges will create new political questions. How will automation affect jobs disproportionately held by women? How will climate change alter patterns of care, migration, and health? How will digital communication transform organizing and representation? Women, like all citizens, will confront these issues within institutions already marked by the legacy of past struggles. What endures is the lesson that political systems are malleable. They reflect the pressures placed upon them, the arguments made within them, and the participation of those once excluded. The story of women who changed America demonstrates that inclusion is not granted once and for all. It is constructed through action. Each vote cast, each office held, each law debated continues that construction. In this sense, the narrative does not conclude with a final triumph or a settled equilibrium. It continues wherever women claim space in decision-making, wherever they challenge assumptions about who leads and who follows, wherever they insist that democracy must account for the full complexity of human lives. The arc from suffrage to leadership roles traces a profound shift, but it is also a foundation for what comes next, an ongoing project shaped by new generations who inherit both the gains and the unfinished work of those who came before.